Book of the New Sun is a story that asks us as readers to engage actively in questioning what's going on in the book, to take a look at this main character, Severian, who is a terrible and wonderful person at the same time, and say, why is he so compelling? What does he have about him that makes him someone that's important enough to follow for this period of time? What is he doing that changes the world? And what is the world doing that changes him? But more importantly, what is this book doing that changes you as you read it?
Quite simply, it's my favourite book of all time. It's the book that I've read the most times or paid the most attention to, I think. And I love the community surrounding it. And it's been a gateway to lots of other amazing books and authors. All roads lead to the Book of the New Sun.
What does the Book of the New Sun mean to me? I see it as a very dark Pilgrim's Progress, where the pilgrim in question is beginning from a very dark and difficult position and working his way up towards a better understanding, a better person.
And now that I'm the creator of the most viewed Book of the New Sun video the world has ever seen, it's a cash cow. And I'm going to milk that wolf dry.
I think Severian's visit to the Botanic Gardens was probably the biggest deal for me early on. Mm-hmm. This is the time when you discover that this world is so much bigger than Severian can imagine, and so much more than it is even going to be detailed in this novel. Severian says, well, how does this mirror work in this way? And this, in modern fantasies, especially young adult fantasies, everything is nailed down. All the magic, everyone talks about their magic systems. And in this case, time travel is the magic, and no one's going to explain it. It's going to be, you can work several different models that seem to be working at the same time for time travel. And whether this is time travel that Severian's in, and what the mirrors mean. And Ajia just says, I don't know how this works. Do you know everything where you're from? Are all the questions answered? And he says, oh, you're right. I live all my life in the tower, and we have all these little rules and things that happen. And I don't know where they came from. They've just been there all the time.
Reading about Severian fighting a giant who's wielding this electrified mace on the top of a Gothic castle with the wind and the rain coming down, it's cool stuff. But the moment that really left my jaw on the floor and left me convinced that the book was a masterpiece on that first read was the moment on the beach where Severian takes off his boots. Of course, there's a famous moment where he realizes that the claw isn't what he thought it was, and that all of the universe, all of the world is divine, is this part of God by default because it comes from God. And the quality of existing gives it this miraculous wonder-like quality. And Severian is so deeply touched that he takes off his boots on the beach and he says that every sand there is divine. So to have a book that goes from that pulp sword and sorcery stuff all the way up to the truly inspirational and transcendent, that's what makes Book of the New Sun what it is.
This actually happens on a regular basis every time I read through the series, several times over. But the first time I read the book, Severian takes part in the Alzebo ritual. He eats the brains of Thekla. This is the woman that he fell in love with and played a hand in her suicide. He takes on her memories, her consciousness in some sort of way. And now you suddenly realize that the Severian that is narrating his memoirs to us at the end of the story isn't the Severian that we thought he was. How would we know that? So it recontextualizes everything that we've just read, all the emotions, all the actions, And now I can't trust the very definition of an unreliable narrator. And I wanted to go right back to the beginning and just start again. And this keeps happening over and over again. And we don't know how many more memories and consciousness he's going to add to the stack inside his brain by the time he gets to the end of the story.
The fly in Cathedral was incredible. The when the Alzebo comes to the door speaking in the voice of the dead child. I mean, I think each volume has at least one signature scene like that. So I don't know. There's just, adventure around every corner.
And then just a few weeks ago, when I was doing the legwork, the research for our big Book of the New Sun video, the first Severian theory came into sharper focus. It was always there in the background. I'd read about it in other places, but didn't pay that much attention to it. Severian even mentions it at the end of the Citadel of the Autarch. He writes something like, I may not be the first of my type to embark on this journey. Another one walks the corridors of time or something. And then it clicked that our Severian, our narrator Severian, is being manipulated a lot more than we ever thought, a lot more than is given credit in the book by other time travelers and the first version of himself, who is a time traveler. So in the whole book, he is walking in the shadow of himself, the shadow of the torturer. But that's not the best bit about the theory, because you can read the book and understand it and love it. You can be an expert on the Book of the New Sun and pay no attention to that most important part of the puzzle. How is that even possible? You can take it or leave it. You can not believe it. But I believe that it's woven into the fabric of the book, and it's been there right from the beginning. And it is the essence of the Book of the New Sun and Severian's identity.
It was clear the first time I read it that I was at a certain point just turning pages, just because I'd heard it was important, but I was confused. I didn't know where everything was going. But when I finally got to the scene in Sword where Dr. Talos points out how they're replaying the story of Frankenstein, that really was the first time that I had inklings of it before, but that was when all of a sudden the scope and the space of what Wolfe was doing really started to sink in. And that was when I knew I was going to reread it. Because I suddenly felt like this is not just confusing. This is confusing for a reason. But there are clues sprinkled through here, and there's a larger story going on at work. And so that was it for me. I mean, there were plenty of other things that were fun, that were odd, like, the finding the claw was a surprise, like, oh, something special is going to happen. When you realize that the towers are spaceships, which I think I did the first time through at a certain point. But those are all fun. But that moment where Talos says, like, don't you recognize this, Severian? That was an incredible moment for me, because it was both in the story, but also somehow stepping out of the story, but doing it in a way that just made everything more interesting, not in a sort of postmodern, wink at the audience kind of way. It was fascinating. It still is to me. Yeah.
And only last week, a few days ago, I noticed that on the cover, I was looking at the cover of the Claw of the Conciliator, right? The Claw of the Conciliator, the Claw, the THE, Claw, the Claw, the Claw, the Claw, Thecla. It spells Thecla right there on the front of the book. Thecla, the Claw. How is that possible? Did Wolfe... Because he didn't go, I've written the thing about the claw and I can name this character Thecla because it looks like the claw, right? It spells the claw. He didn't do that because the word the name Thekla means something that is to do with her character. So it's either a massive coincidence or he has pulled these two things. I don't know how he could have planned it, or he'd done everything and it just so happened to spell the claw. And he went, oh, I'm going to have to invent a claw now. And the claw's the most important part of the book in many ways as well. So, and then I checked on the internet thinking that I discovered something amazing. And no, loads of people have seen it, not just me. Well, yeah, it's a thing. But at least I saw it for myself. And
I've read Book of the New Sun many times now, so it's hard to go back to the absolute first. But one thing that did strike me was when I was reading Citadel of the Autarch, and for a rare moment, Severian interrupted his narrative of his journey and that eventful summer where he was cast out of the guild and came back as Autarch to talk about where he's about to go. And he mentions this ritual where he is put into a room full of anti-gravity and made to float up into a tower with skulls whistling around him and orbiting like planets. And he makes a lot out of the sound he can hear from those skulls and starts to bring up this metaphor of the dead listening in at the doorway at what humanity's doing now. The idea that everything that has happened in human history is leading up to the point that we are now, and that the dead are only interlopers who can watch this moment, even though we are standing on their skulls, their shoulders, and everything they've done before us. It was at that moment that I realized not only were we really reaching for a large theme, but also that we had two stories going on in the Book of the New Sun. The story of Severian the Journeyman Torturer and the story of Severian the Autarch, who is getting ready to go off on his great journey that we don't even get to hear about until the coda that happens after the series. And that was a really fun realization for me.
this video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much.
How many times have I read the Book of the New Sun? I don't know. I must have lost track after 5 or 7. I mean, I must have read it at least 2 or 3 times before I even started the lexicon. So, you know, and then I'm working on a dictionary, so I read it a couple more times, and then I've read it since then. So I don't know, but I continue to read it.
I think at this point I've read the Book of the New Sun about 4 times through, and that includes my first reads of it and then rereading it for the podcast and then rereading it while I'm reading it for the podcast. Also, there's been countless times that I've gone back to a particular chapter or really dug into something like the play to try and figure out everything that's going on there to the best of my ability. But at this point, 4 feels pretty good as a all the way through number. I'd love to get back for the 5th sometime soon.
So how many times have you read the Book of the New Sun?
Technically, properly, 3, I think. Although the first time I read it was just the books back to back. I've got to be honest, I don't think I finished Earth of the New Sun. I don't remember DNF in it, but I don't remember that second half of Earth of the New Sun, which is kind of my favourite bit now. I don't think I got that far. I got a bit too spaceshipy, yes-oddy for me. Shame on me. And then the second time, a few years later, was like a hybrid read. I read the books, but if I was out and about or driving, I would listen to the audio, and occasionally I would do the old hybrid read where you listen to it and read along. And then the third time, which wasn't that long ago, was physical, I actually read the folio. I read my folios. Can you see that on the camera? I read the actual folio. And after each chapter, I stopped, paused, and I would listen to the full explanation from Alzebo Soup. And then I would listen to ReReading Wolfe, the ones that they've made, because they haven't done the whole Book of the New Sun yet. And I would consult the Lexicon Earthus. But then during the research for our big video, I think I've probably read it another couple of times in chunks, because once I start reading a little bit for research, I had to finish the chapter, or sometimes 2 or 3, because I love it so much. So technically 3. Oh, and it's been my toilet reading for the last couple of years as well. Not the folio. Don't take folios into the toilet. All right.
I've read it between 7 and 8 times. I lost track somewhere along there. 4 or 5 before starting the show, and then another 2 or 3 as we went through it and recorded it, because not only did we read it, we read it again, and then we read it a third time on air, essentially. So I don't feel like that's a big number. I feel like those are loser numbers to say I only read it 8 or 9 times, but that's where I'm at.
Aside from Severian, we'll just say, not excluding Severian, there are so many characters. It's hard to narrow it down. I mean, the giant Baldanders, delicate Dorcas, so many characters, but I can't help but think that it's Agia. Forgive me, but there's something about the femme fatale. What is it? I don't know, but I do think that she's just exceptionally interesting, and there's something about that woman. I don't know.
Severian. I'll pick another one.
Dr. Talos.
Yeah, that's. I mean, if I was going to just say, Talos is the best formed character. I mean, obviously Dorcas and Jolinda. I mean, they are what they are, but it's Talos that you can imagine someone writing another novel about.
Yeah. No, you mentioned Dorcas. Dorcas is also a character who, the more you think about her, the more realistic the suffering she goes through becomes, at least for me. Because I think when I first read it, it was a simple feeling of like, oh yeah, that's sad. But especially as I get older, and the more I think about what it would mean to come back without anything, and how complicated that makes the idea of resurrection in the book, it's a tragic story. And so I think it's the sadness of Dorcas makes her not my favorite, but she's definitely one of the most compelling characters, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I like Thecla. I mean, we only see her really early in the book, but I really like when Severian first encounters her, and she just kind of takes over, and you don't really realize that, but then you realize how she's saying his name over and over and over, and how she's pumping him for information. And then she uses that information that she gets from Severian to strong-arm Gerlo, so that you're going to make Severian my companion, my only companion, because that way that gives her more control also over her situation. If she had some different person every day, it would be very complicated in order to do what she does. But she makes her life better in the cell by arranging things to her liking.
I really like Jonas, even though he doesn't actually do that much, and he's only around for like half a book. I think he's got the most interesting backstory and a probable window onto that wider universe. He's an androidy thing, so he's a machine, but with AI, like human intelligence downloaded. I think he's got human consciousness, like he's like a nest, like an egg, like a conduit for a human, but put into a synthetic body, right? I think, and then he survives a spaceship crash and repairs himself using flesh and blood and bone. So he's like a backwards android rather than a human type person repairing themselves with metal bits, which is quite common in science fiction. He's a robot repairing himself with fleshy bits, but he may still have a proper human brain inside there. So don't tell me that the Book of the New Sun isn't science fiction.
I am terrible at answering favorites questions because I like so many things. And one of the things that really sticks out to me in Book of the New Sun is the multiplicity of ways that Gene Wolfe articulates his characters, particularly the small ones. One of the things I think he does that is just genius is he's able to breathe life into characters that are only on 2 or 3 pages of a 5-book series. I think about characters like Odilo, who only shows up as a servant in the House Absolute for 1 chapter, but is so unique that you understand his motivations and why he's doing what he's doing, and he even gets a side story after Gene Wolfe writes the Book of the New Sun. I think of someone like Master Ash, who's only in there for a couple of chapters, but within his encapsulated story, we hear all about a possible future of Earth and how Severian stops that future from occurring by taking an action that Ash doesn't expect. I think of Typhon, someone who looms over the entire series as the closest thing we have to the primary villain, but he actually only makes 2 brief appearances in 2 books on the page. I think of someone like Olton, a librarian who's only there briefly, but is the representative of Borges, an author that Gene Wolfe loved so much that he wrote a simulacra of that character into his novel and then made him a librarian just as he was a librarian in real life, to give us a little inside joke nod to what a great author he is and also the importance he holds in Gene Wolfe's literary canon.
I think Jonas is from the distant past relative to the book that we're reading. So he's an ancient person, but he's still from the future of our world. So he fits that middle bit of the time frame, but he's from a time close enough to what we recognize as Earth, where countries like China and Korea still existed. Those names still existed. And I believe Jonas is actually Korean, or more specifically, North Korean. So Gene Wolfe served in the Korean War and folded that experience into the book. Joining the dots, let me get this right, joining the dots from information that was given to us by Jonas himself, even though he was going slightly backwards crazy at the time, and a conversation between Severian and Syriaca in Sword of the Lictor. I believe North Korea, the real North Korea, the Kim Jong-un family, continued with its cult of personality, totalitarian style government thing into the future. It was the North Koreans that left Earth and explored the galaxy. It was the North Koreans that were the de facto representatives of humanity. We didn't want that, but that's what they did. They were the ones that made the jump. They were too aggressive, and the galactic aliens, whoever it was out there, said, right, you can't do that. And they pushed us back. And the punishment was a black hole in the sun. So it was North Korea's fault. And it's information that is drip fed through Jonas, and it also mirrors what's going on in the war, which is the whole backdrop to the whole Book of the New Sun. You've got these 2 factions, the Commonwealth and the Askians, and one kind of represents some sort of monarchy, democracy. I know they're different, but that kind of thing down here. And then you've got the clone army, the Askians, the North Koreans in the north. And I think Wolfe is writing about, the 50s, what was going on with Wolfe at the time and he's transferred it into the Book of the New Sun. And then Jonas himself, he's having this backward breakdown, memory relapse, time dilation, awakening thing, which is really interesting to watch because he doesn't quite know. He's out of time. He's in the wrong place, and it's starting to freak him out and come back to him. And then he jumps in a portal and he disappears off the planet, and then probably comes back as a zombie soldier.
It's really hard not to pick the obvious, simple answer and say Severian, because the whole book is about him. It's his whole story through his perspective. But not only do we see his rise from lowly torturer's apprentice all the way to autarch, king of the world and beyond, but we see the development of his interiority and his thought processes. And I'm particularly thinking of his quality of judgment, where he comes from his childhood with an assumption that we can judge others and know what's best for them and how people should act, behave, or live in the world. And time after time, he has his judgment challenged, thrown back into his face, or just shown to be subtly wrong in ways that make him reevaluate that position. By the time he reaches the end of Earth of the New Sun, he's reached a place of, in the story, his divine peak. He's literally the new god of Earth. But in that comes a very hands-off approach, where he's come to a place where he realizes that even as a god, he doesn't have the capacity to truly know others and be able to make decisions for them. And so he has to say to the fisherman on the beach, be good, try not to interfere with people, and do the best you can. And I think that's inspiring. And it makes for wonderful literature in the true capital L sense, where it's about realistic human thinking, about the interiority of characters and trying to evoke that on the page. Plus, he has a cool sword and wears a black cape, so, that automatically puts him in first place.
Because I'm a massive dork.
Because it's a book that can sustain it. I was inspired by another podcast that went through Dark Souls with such a fine-tooth comb. And they explored every piece of the game, every part of the lore and the gameplay. And I was really surprised by this form of podcast because it was able to sustain my interest. It takes 40 hours to go through one of these games at this pace, and yet it was compelling the whole way through. But also it helped me recognize the artistry in the games. And because they could support such a thorough investigation, it really elevated them in my estimation. And I said, who's a good author that fits this format? And I called up Metz almost on a whim and said, what we should do is we should go through Book of the New Sun as slowly as possible, looking at every single word on the page and just really giving it a good go. And Metz said, sure, we'll need to do 3 years of warm-up before we actually get to Shadow, but that sounds like a good idea. We'll devote our life to that. And so it goes.
It crept up on me. I didn't think it would be quite such a big thing. I was being patient, waiting for a dictionary. I thought there was a dictionary in progress. It just seemed natural to me that something based on the article of Words Weird and Wonderful in Gene Wolfe's Castle of the Otter, it seemed like, well, all you have to do is that and it's done. So I waited patiently for a few years, and then I ran out of patience, and I wrote directly to Gene Wolfe, and I asked him if anybody was working on such a thing. And if not, I would like to do it because, I didn't want to put in a lot of work and duplicate the efforts of somebody else. He wrote right back to me and said, nobody was working on such a thing, and I was free to do it. So then I started doing that. And, it wasn't nearly as easy as I thought it would be. Initially, I thought, okay, because the premise of it is that none of the words are made up. So therefore, I thought, being an English major, I thought they will all be found in the Oxford English Dictionary. So the main difficulty would be compiling the list of the words to look up. But the source would just be one source, the OED. So, relatively simple. But it's not that simple at all. And the words are not all found in the OED. In fact, it's very eye-opening as to the weird little nooks and crannies, collections of obscure but real English words hidden in all sorts of strange collections and out-of-the-way places. And I was doing this all prior to internet stuff, so where I'm going through physical books in real libraries and all that kind of thing. And so it ended up being a lot bigger than I thought. And then, having sunk that much into the lexicon Earthus, I started doing more work and from there. But that was for the Book of the New Sun, the first project. And that's how I started. And then, then other products like guidebook see, now I'm messing up the title of the thing. Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, a chapter guide, which by some rights should have been my first book, but of course I was not yet able to do that because I hadn't done the lexicon yet. So the chapter guide is a distillation and a, first reader friendly version of material in the lexicon. And, so that was, decades after the lexicon. So I have been working on it for a while.
We met by talking on the Earth List, which was an old email group that was really for a long time the only place online, and probably the first place online, that you could really get into stuff about Wolfe and find other people who had read him, other people who were spinning wild theories, looking things up, trying to find allusions, all kinds of stuff. But we had been emailing on there for some 15 years. And it was a great place where all these people who had read the books many times would get together and puzzle things out, talk about questions, come up with ideas. So much so that people were writing, long, thousands of words essays, basically for one email that was going to be read by maybe a dozen people.
Right.
But that level of depth and commitment and really the way that everybody treated each other's ideas very seriously, even if they totally disagreed, that was something that we really kind of wanted. And so once we were recording it and thinking about it, we kind of made a point to really want to get to that experience again, of having that community of people who were willing to really spend time on it. And so that's why we always say, we don't care about spoilers. Like if you haven't read it before and you just want a companion going first time through it, our thing isn't for you, because we're catering to that kind of person who gets obsessive about it and really wants to really dive in there and do it. And there are many, many people who want to. We're surprised with how many people keep finding us, and wanting and really appreciating that something like the Wolfe List is around.
I really love Gene Wolfe, and not just the Book of the New Sun, but all of the novels and novellas and short stories that he has given us in a massive career that spanned decades. And it's a thrill to be able to pour into any one of those for a given episode, no matter how long it takes, no matter how confused I am after the first time I read them. But if I have to be honest, the reason that I was so excited to read the Book of the New Sun and go really in depth with it is because I got a call from my friend Phil, and he said, "Hey, let's do this together." And Phil is the kind of guy that I can have a conversation about almost anything with for hours on end. And we are happy to dig into the meat of something as deep as it goes. And boy, is there plenty of depth to plumb with Wolfe. So when I heard about this, I said, that's great. if you had just asked me to read the Book of the New Sun with you, we'd be having all of these conversations anyway. So it's probably a good idea to record it. And I was thrilled that I did. And it's also helped me discover a great community and a wonderful group of people who are trying to unpack this just the same way that we are, as well as people who were intimidated and might have never tried to read the Book of the New Sun. And the fact that we've been able to provide that help for so many people, as well as be able to talk to each other at a level that really makes us still excited about these books, is just one of the best feelings I've ever had in my life.
This video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much.
You know, the thing about symbols, as the Kumeyan said, words are symbols, and they can mean different things in different contexts. Just as you say the word magic, as the Kumeyan said, if you choose to call what we do here magic, then magic exists while we do it, and that's the same way with the symbols in the Book of the New Sun. This isn't an allegory, I think, where every little element has a key. He's doing more than one thing in every event.
The way you get into it is to look at the discussion of what people have tried to figure out. Like, if you go in saying, okay, well, what does the rose symbol mean? And what does the black symbolize? And what does, it's not going to work like that. You can start with things like that. But it may not stay consistent throughout the whole thing. And other people will point out that in certain contexts, it might be pointing to different traditions where those things have different associations. And that's part of that's actually a big thematic part of what he's doing with the Brown Book and a lot of the stories, even in the play, where part of the point is that over time, meanings are lost, are recontextualized. They contain and preserve certain aspects of themselves, but also get distorted and warped and changed. And history does that. Being in time, being a living person in time, means that anytime you deal with issues of like ultimate meaning and you try to get through them through things like symbols, you're always in a messy world. And so to think that there's an easy way to just decode things to get to the ultimate truth, I don't know that it's there, but the frustration and the difficulty of it is why you want to do it, because that's the only way to actually engage with those issues. Reminds me of the same thing that the angel tells the rooster, right? When he comes down, he's like, we're higher than you, so we have a better sense of what the Increate wants from things, but he's still a mystery to us. And I love that as an incredibly important thing to remember about this book. Anytime you think you've got it figured out, that even the angels, who you would think would, as the messengers of God, would be the ones who could clarify things for you, even they tell you, yeah, we're trying to puzzle things out ourselves still.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's as Nod and as Gabriel say in the play, right? I just have to guess at it. Even Severian's symbols on his mausoleum, Severian feels like he knows, but there's always been some debate where, does Severian really know? Is he misinterpreting the meaning of these symbols?
My guess is that a lot of people who start trying to unpack the Book of the New Sun go for what jumps out to them as obviously weird or maybe out of place, or something that reminds them of symbolism they've seen before that they can really tap into. This could be something like the vocabulary or naming conventions. It could be the really big puzzles that are placed in the story, like how did Severian see a castle in the sky that just vanished? approached as he was leaving Nessus. And it could be something like an obvious biblical reference, the temptation of Christ in the desert, that's mirrored in the scene with Typhon in Sword of the Lictor. I think there's something rewarding for going after any of those directions, and there's no single right way to unpack the Book of the New Sun. Wolfe was so smart about writing it with all of these layers that he's given us many avenues to try ourselves in order to get into it. For me, one thing that really helps is trying to remember the overarching story beats and the larger questions that might be implied by putting all of these little stories and puzzles together. Questions like, can a human being like Severian, who is raised in a world where he is supposed to torture human beings, ever become what we would consider a good person? Once he becomes a good person, could he always be a good person, or is he going to fall from that state of grace? Is it ever possible for him to atone for some of the most awful things that he's done in the story? What does it mean that we have a single human being who is representative of everything on Earth, and also that that person has 1,000 people within them from who knows how many centuries of us trying to find that person who can represent all of Earth? Who even came up with this idea of the Autark Project in the first place? Once you start to interrogate those bigger questions, I think you start to see why Wolfe's work is something that's managed to last since the 80s as a major work of science fiction, and why so many authors and readers go back to it for inspiration time and time again. Because these are the questions that we're still struggling with today and will probably be struggling with hundreds of years from now.
There's the fallacy that all readers have when they finish the book and they like it a lot, and then they meet other people that really like that book a lot, and they think, yay, and everything is wonderful, because there's this fallacy that they all took it the same way. And it doesn't really matter any particular book, I'm sure it's like this, but just speaking from experience, as soon as you start talking about the details and you start getting some friction, and it gets to the point pretty quickly where you didn't read the same book. I mean, it's the same book, but you're taking it so differently that you immediately start having these schisms. So again, that's the first fallacy, is that just because you've all read the same book and you all like the same book, when you try to talk about what you like about it, there may be some superficial things that you can all agree on there, but in the Book of the New Sun, very quickly you get into these things which leads to grand theories and things like that, where it's just, everything fragments into warring camps, and it's just gets like that. So that's the good news and the bad news, is that, the initial thought that, you like a book, and you've met other people who like the book, and so you're all going to be friends is, well, you can be friends, but you've got such different ideas of what it is.
Yes and no. Antihero is kind of an odd word here, because when we think of that, we think of Shadow the Hedgehog, the bad guy who ends up working for good. But Severian is an anti-hero in the sense that the book is a deconstruction of that typical hero's archetype, where we have our character with his cool sword and his cool black cloak and his good looks, and he's secretly the heir to this, that, and the other. He's primed to go through a series of adventures and always come out in the right. But in a lot of ways, Wolfe is challenging those presumptions that we bring to science fiction, fantasy, and other genre works, where we have an assumption that the protagonist is going to be in this sort of superhuman, morally superhuman place, where because they are the hero of the story, they are allowed to do things like kill people indiscriminately, overthrow nations, pilot the cool spaceship away from the Empire, or the other things we assume that a human does in genre fiction. So Severian challenges that, and we see how behaving in that way, while sometimes does work in his favor, sometimes it does not too, and leads him into rough places. And again, by the end of the story, he's come to a place where he's learned that even though he is the most important person in the history of Earth, that still doesn't give him the right to do anything except step back. So Severian definitely is an anti-hero, but not in the way we usually think of in that term. He's not Ghost Rider or Venom or like a hero, a bad guy turned hero in that sense, but something that's working on a much more nuanced level.
I don't think so. I think Severian is a complicated hero. I think a lot of the time people focus on his Christ-like aspects or attributes, but there are times when he's closer to the Antichrist. So I just don't see him as an anti-hero. I think he's just a complex, complicated hero who has these elements of his own opposite. And to tie this back into the first Severian, if I may, I think the first Severian was more like a 50-50. In other words, 50% Christ, 50% Antichrist. And so narrative Severian is, however, higher percentage of Christ and smaller percentage of Antichrist. I think that's what we're talking about for the distinction between first Severian and second Severian or narrative Severian, the final Severian that we know. And this process of improving, I typically use a shorthand of saying, take a sad song and make it better. So that's what it is. First Severian was a very sad song. Very sad song. And he is working on his own past to make it better. The result is the same. There's no question about it's not making a better ending. The ending is the same apocalyptic ending, but it's the process to get there. And so, like I say, moving the counter up from, say, 50% Christ, 50% Antichrist to, some higher percentage of Christ-like and a smaller percentage of Antichrist-like.
Is Severian the ultimate anti-hero? Well, I think I would think we would say he's probably not the ultimate anti-hero. There are many anti-heroes. He's a good one, though.
If he's an anti-hero, that's one thing I would disagree with the question. I'm not so sure he is an anti-hero. I think he's actually more of a regular guy in a very difficult world. He seems more, honestly, unexceptional to me than a sort of rebel with a cause or something like that, as he's often portrayed and as he likes to think of himself early on in the books. But I think in the end, the story is much more powerful if Severian, despite what he says about his memory, despite what he will say about his destiny, if he really isn't all that special, if he really is just a man in the world, then a lot of this becomes in many ways more powerful. Like, what are the possibilities there? It's a great story if he is a Christ figure. Wolfe himself has said he wasn't Christ. He was Christ-like. So, and that's something that can be said of, anyone.
Or he's a Christian figure. He's trying to become Christ, right?
Yeah. And for it still to have all the consequences that it does in the story, I think in many ways that's a much more interesting story to tell than to just be saying, hey, I'm going to tell another New Testament story and it's just in the future and, has weird things like Alzebos and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think I see your point. An anti-hero is more of a bad guy who ends up doing a lot of good things, and Severian is just ignorant. He's limited. He's often cruel, very cruel, but at no point is his cruelty ever given, upraised to some level of, well, this had to be done.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe in Earth of the New Sun, you could argue that Wolfe has kind of transformed the villain into a hero. But even then, I'm not even sure you would call it an anti-hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because, I mean, yes, he's a torturer, right? He starts off as a torturer, but he also goes to great pains to say this is the only life he knew. These were the only people who had ever been something like a family to him. And he lived an incredibly sheltered life. So it's not like he's a rebel in the sense of being like, and torture is good, even though the rest of the world thinks it's horrible. Instead, he thinks it's sort of his institutional duty just to do that. And it
to do a bad
takes him
thing,
time
to be bad,
to start to grow out of that position. So, so it's all of it. That depends on, what you mean by anti-hero. But I still think in the end, it's less a story of a sort of hero or anti-hero and more a story of a guy who may be really good with a sword and have a good memory, but when all is said and done, Severian's just as flawed and messed up and normal as all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly as flawed and messed up as all of us. And I think that's really kind of the whole point of Wolfe doing all of these first-person narrators who were infamously called unreliable narrators, which is true. But he's basically just applying, in his view, realism. Everybody is an unreliable narrator. Every memory is an unreliable narrator. Our experiences are unreliable narrators.
Yeah. There is a tendency too, because of the genre, that Severian is portrayed, and he of course portrays himself as a kind of hero. I mean, he tells you from the beginning, this is the story of how I became autarch, right? This is the story of how I became the most powerful man in the world. And so he even says, right, I had some presentiment of my future. So he feels like, I was destined for this. He'll say all these things, but at the same time, the actual story he tells is a story of chance, is a story of missteps, is a story of all kinds of things that, make you, say how right is he about that? He's probably not, but then you don't know because he's involved with the claw and all sorts of other things. So there's enough question and enough mix of misdirection and of just flat out error and mistakes that he makes along the way that, once you're done with the books, even though this has the form of the hero with the sword who's going to go save the world or become the king or whatever, it doesn't work that way. And it's a very different kind of story. And it's clear that all the things that are happening to him along the way, in fact, all the things that actually get him to the throne in the end, are all kinds of events that are far, far outside of his control. And it's more about how he comes, I feel like, to realize that and to deal with it. And despite his tone many times, I actually think there is a large amount of humility that comes through, both intentionally and unintentionally, through the ways he tells his story, through the ways he ultimately shows that he wasn't 100% responsible for any successes that he has. Even in Earth of the New Sun, it becomes even more clear there that, he recognizes he's a tool of forces that are going on all around him, and that at most he can sort of tweak things, and he tries to. Whether or not he succeeds or not, I don't know that even he knows at the end of Earth. So I feel like it is a story where you get the sort of shape of a hero, but the actual character that develops throughout the whole thing, he's a person. It's more of a regular novel than a hero or anti-hero story in the end.
I think Taylor Swift would say that Severian is in no way an anti-hero.
Go with it, man. Go with it.
Now I have to quote Taylor Swift's lyrics, and I can't do that. By the time we get to the end of Earth of the New Sun, we've been listening to Severian describe events and himself and how he thinks and who he thinks he is for something like 1,000 pages of Gene Wolfe's writing. And it's very easy to remember who he is at the end of those books because he's been built up to be something great and incredible and frankly transcendent, something that we're not even sure humanity can aspire to, and he might be the only one who can get there. At the same time, he was the lowest of the low when he started, and that's a very important part of his journey. Not only was he being raised to be a professional torturer and hurt people, not just for a living, but because it was his duty to do that for the state, but also he was an orphan with no firm understanding of who his family was or where he came from. It was one of the few gaps in his purported perfect memory, other than a distant idea that his mother existed and coddled him at one point. And Severian, as a character, is supposed to represent something in the human struggle, that he is capable of terrible things just as much as he is capable of amazing beneficence and almost saintly behavior. That whole range is within what he does as he tricks people and offers them kindness and heals them and cures their diseases for no apparent reason. Those characteristics are expressed as he tricks people or hurts them or casually murders them or heals them or brings them back to life or provides them a kindness that allows them to escape whatever situation they might be in, over and over again throughout the novels. He also is somebody who can go to these great heights and then descend back down just a few moments later, so that you see the good and the bad playing out over and over again through his journey. That's key to me, because Severian is not supposed to be just an anti-hero or just a saintly godlike superhuman. He has to be both, because he is representing who we are as humanity to Yesod and to the Increate, and trying to live by an example of being good in order to prove that he deserves what he has gotten by the end of Earth of the New Sun.
Yeah, what he said.
I believe that this play, the whole point of the play, is the whole backstory. And I don't mean just all the great themes and all blah, 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 blah. No. I mean in detail, the backstory of the world, all these questions that you want to know, all the questions about what's in that cave where the man-apes were, all of the questions about the war and the battle and what's at stake between Typhon and the Megatherians and the Hieroglyphs. It's all there.
Do I understand the play? I think I definitely understand more about how the play came to be, how it is an interpretation of a time loop artifact, how Severian wrote his story. No, he dictated his story to somebody else, and then that got collected into a different story and then sent back through time, like the Terminator, and then Dr. Talos found it and adapted it into this play. I get what the play is and how it came to be, and then how Severian ended up being a part of his own legend. I get more of that. And do I understand the play? It's very biblical. It is a warped version of the Book of the New Sun itself, because it's the story we're reading being told by the person who's narrating it in the first place, and then it's popped out as this play through different layers, a mirror of what the book is itself through Wolfe and through interpretation and translation. So I love that. But beyond that, could I sit here and tell you who the characters are and what they do and what it all means? No.
Yeah, I think in the end, it does give you a lot of clues about the larger backstory mythology of what's going on. There's still plenty of room to disagree about the details of what's actually being said about the things, because it is allegory told through both half and misremembered other myths that are all mixed up together as well, just like all the rest of the Brown Book stories. But yeah, of course, when I first read it, I had no clue. And right, it seems random and weird and surreal. And in some cases,
and I pushed forward. And I pushed forward reading that play because I believed that I trusted that when I got to the end of the novel, it would all be explained.
And remember too, the play is not finished, right? The play is interrupted. So we don't know how the play actually ends.
That's true.
Well, which is a totally different question. But no, I think for the most part, what does the play do? It helps establish enough clues to the background of the mythology in the world and sort of the larger drama that's going on, and confirms a lot of things that are suggested elsewhere.
Do I understand the play? Yes, to my satisfaction, I do understand the play.
The play is relatively easy to understand. It's what happens when a cheeky android who apparently has a good understanding of theater history from the Greeks up to the Elizabethan Jacobean era tries to write a play that aggrandizes his master and at the same time does a satirical takedown of the current leader of Earth.
People have a lot of theories about it. I think he has set it up, Gene Wolfe has set it up so that we are, on the first read, we are led to believe it is this vaudeville comedy take on the Bible.
And therefore a candidate for the epitome of it, not knowing that he's cast somebody in the play who happens to be the author of the religious text that he's based this play on, after that guy goes thousands of years into the future and then gets transported from another world back thousands of years into the past to write said religious text. So he doesn't even know that he's acting in that play as he performs pivotal roles in it on the stage.
I mean, the title of the play is Eschatology in Genesis. So we take that as meaning this is the end of things, like Book of Revelation and Genesis. So it's almost like the record just starts over again, when it's not supposed to, but it has. And so we read it that way. Again, this is this vaudeville kind of comedy, and it makes sense. Like, whoa, didn't see that coming. It's supposed to be the end of the world, and instead it just starts over again.
Or you might be asking, is this the actual Book of the New Sun, which is referenced by the title of the series? Or perhaps you're thinking this is like the true history of the Conciliator. There's all these options, but none of them quite fits right. And Wolfe delays all the way past the normal ending of the book out into the coda. And that's when we finally get it and it becomes understandable. So it's no wonder that it has this reputation for being difficult. It's on first attack, it really is something else. But he put in the answer for us. We're quite lucky.
And it's not until you read the fifth book, Earth of the New Sun, that you realize how much was actually being foreshadowed.
Then you throw in the fact that there are some aliens watching it who do know all of this context, and that Baldanders starts to glean onto it while the play's happening and decides to attack them because he thinks they're making fun of him. And you really understand that it's been right in front of you the whole time.
It's not that Severian is the new Noah. Severian's the angel of the flood. Severian's the angel of destruction.
Severian is not the chosen one. Severian is the expected one, but the whole world could have been different. Any number of events could have happened differently, so that things didn't work out for Severian, including Severian's own choices. At every moment, he has the option of choosing a different path for Earth. And this just happens to be the one that he chose.
Is Severian the chosen one? Yes, no, maybe. Wait. Is Severian the chosen one? He is the most important human figure. He's the most important person that ever lived in this universe, in this divine year. Anyway, he is the center, the cause and the effect of human civilization from the Keystone to the flood. However, the way I understand it is there's more than one candidate to be the new sun in the book. Baldander's, right, I think. And isn't the autark program the way that the different consciousness go through the different people and you collect the next person, you pass it on to the next person? Isn't that a way of choosing the chosen one? I guess it doesn't matter if he's the chosen one or not then, because but time travel messes with my head, because certain people know that he does indeed become the new sun, so they can go back in time and make it so. So he is the chosen one because he's the chosen one.
It can be tempting when we're talking about whether or not Severian is the chosen one to fall on either absolutely, yes, he's there and there's a reason Severian's the author of this book, or no, this is all random circumstance and he doesn't realize how lucky he is to be in the place where he happened to score the biggest win in the history of humanity. But I think both of those examples ignore the possibility that both could be true. This is a little bit complex, but it is true that Severian is the chosen one in the sense that he's writing this book. People and beings throughout the book say, you are the chosen one. And it seems that he can do no wrong and he happens to be successful in all of the ways he needs to and fits in the slot of all the legends and becomes the person who is the epitome of Earth and is proven to be the epitome of Earth in the trial he has with Zadkiel in Earth of the New Sun. To the point where, gosh, all of this must have been preordained. But even in Earth of the New Sun, where that gets stated, we have a chapter where Afeta says, yes, you are the chosen one. And we know because we've watched every planet in the galaxy and possibly several iterations of life appearing on these planets. And Severian himself at the end of Citadel of the Autarch says, you know, I don't think I was the first Severian. There was one before me. And he may have died like half a dozen times over the course of the book and somehow been resurrected there. Is that because of his chosen one status or because he happens to have the power in him already because he went to the future to go back to get it in the past? Boy, we're in a loop situation now, aren't we? So all of this is trying to express that it's possible that random chance is something that is involved in creating a chosen one. And it's possible that the Increate, who we truly can't understand in this book, is aware of that and has used infinity as a tool to leverage a chosen one into the position they need to be to complete this divine year cycle that allows life to exist from one universe to the next as it expands and collapses in on itself.
Well, according to the plot, Severian very much is a chosen one. He's been manipulated into the role he's in very specifically and set to become the epitome of Earth. With all these conspiracies on multiple levels of government and space government and divine government, pushing him into the position where he can fulfill this role. But at the same time, that chosen one role is just one cog in the machine that is the divine year, this reoccurring process where the universe expands to the extremes of its entropy and then collapses in heat death, and there has to be a way that life continues past that. So life has engineered a way of basically replicating itself into recurring versions of the universe, essentially. And what we kind of learn is that the whole process that's going on, all the hidden machinations behind the book and the plot, are really just the process of the universe having sex with itself, essentially, and perpetuating life as a concept into infinity. So at the same time, Wolfe is exploring this concept of infinity, but also using this chosen one narrative or this Jesus-like figure narrative to put it in a context, a divine context, or a context of science fiction that's so big that it hits that sense of wonder that we associate with science fiction, that recognition of how small humans are against the vastness of the universe. Here we even have this Christ-like figure, the God of Earth is just still this tiny mote in this gigantic process that goes on into the farthest reaches of thought.
The case for Severian being the chosen one folds into one of the grand ideas, the big overarching thing, the theme of the whole book that I subscribe to. In Ian M. Banks's The Culture, I think it was Consider Fleabas, he talks about a place where a person emerges with miraculous abilities. Every roll of the dice, every card they pull, every decision they make, everything is perfect. It appears that they have godlike powers, and the population knows this, and it's tested. They are the king of the planet. Okay. But then Banks suggests that in a population of a civilization of many, many billions of people, statistically and probably someone will pop up who'll just so happen to get all the answers right, no matter what they do. Statistically speaking, not miraculously. Severian could just be that guy. Whichever path he chose was always the right one. And these people in control of Yesod and waiting to uplift the people into the next universe, that whole thing, the whole idea behind this book, they're watching millions and millions, billions of planets over billions of years, a silly amount, and they're monitoring this for the new sun to pop up. Doesn't mean that Severian has any power whatsoever. It just means that he is that factor. It's the monkeys type in the works of Shakespeare. Severian could just be the monkey. And I think Wolfe leaves all of this up to chaos rather than divinity, if you want it. They're both on the table, because he also suggests and leaves room for God. And the Increate could be above the whole thing and could very well be selecting Severian and saying, you are the chosen one. So does that make him the chosen one, or is he just a statistical anomaly? There's room for both.
Yes or no? Is he the chosen one?
Yes or no? I don't know. Ask Driussi.
I do think he's the chosen one, but I hesitate about that. He, again, back to the first Severian theory, grand theory, the first Severian did it without the miracles. He did it. So what we're seeing is a refinement, a prettied up version of it. So he was capable of doing it. He did it. And now it's just going to be, well, take a sad song and make it better.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there about a kind of Platonic distinction between something divine and perfect and something actually instantiated in time, which is different from just sort of an infinity that just goes on. And it's more that the infinite is the perfect because it's, in a Platonic sense, it is, yeah, greater. But it's, I don't know. I'll admit, I don't know that either the chosen one or infinity are really the right categories, because they both step away from Severian's reality of his experience of these things. And it's a first person novel told from one person's perspective. And Wolfe was always very serious about never being able to break out of your perspective.
That's absolutely,
knowing whether you are the chosen one or whether there is an infinity are both things you could only know when you are outside of your own perspective. So I think the book is silent on either issue in the end. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
The Book of the New Sun has a lot of allusions, and a lot of source material comes from literature and the Bible and genre. So there's a lot of material packed in there, and it's woven together in such a way that it seems, it seems whole cloth. And that's one reads it a second time, or a subsequent times, one always sees new things, because once you know the end point, once you know the full story, you see how these little details were so important to building toward that end. And everything really is kind of going in one direction. And you see even casual things, very slight things, have much larger repercussions later.
But why do we reread it? I mean, that we specifically reread it all the time now because we're obligated to. But beyond that, no, I mean, because it pays off doing it, because when you reread, you find new things, you find new ways to look at it. If you read a book and you just want to know what happens and move on, or if you just have the absolute desire to master every detail, I don't know that you can ever really be satisfied here, because I don't know that in the end it's something you can decode, where you can figure out how each part works. Part of the amazing thing about it to me is, in some ways, how inconsistent it is, while still suggesting other or deeper consistencies that you might not have recognized or expected before. That to me is fascinating. And that's what I like in a lot of literature, for me, a certain kind of, call it productive ambiguity about things. And that may be more my style and what I make of it. I know other people don't feel that it is that way. Other people feel that the book can be decoded and you can figure out all the puzzles. And maybe that's so. I haven't ever hit that point for myself yet. So that's one reason why I like to keep coming back to it, because it still keeps me interested and productively, engagingly mystified. Yeah. Put it that way.
Well, the more you bring to the book, the more you get out of it. And so every time you read it, it does inspire you to go and check something else out. And so then you come back to the book with that into your arm. You say, "Well, this," and you're just it just keeps giving.
When I try to convince somebody to read the Book of the New Sun for the first time, the advice I usually give is, don't try to solve it. Instead, read for the experience. Let the weirdness wash over you. Don't spend your time trying to understand every weird word that Gene Wolfe uses. Instead, try to understand the overarching story, follow Severian. When something crazy happens, feel free to laugh and say, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen next?" Right? That is the goal, is to find a way to enjoy this text rather than to unpack it completely. Because if you do that, you'll get a clear picture of Severian's journey and the overarching story that leads him from apprentice torturer to autarch of Earth. Once you've done that, now is the time to go back into the book and start really questioning those vocabulary words. What is Wolfe communicating by using an archaic name for a saber-toothed tiger? And why did he choose that instead of just saying saber-toothed tiger like we all understand? What's the meaning of this naming convention where humans are named after saints, non-humans are named after mythological figures, and how does that provide us new ways to look at the book? What was really going on in that scene you completely didn't get in the Botanic Gardens the first time Aegea and Severian walked through it? And why does Severian go back to the Sand Garden at the very end of the series? All of these questions you can investigate because you've had the context of reading through the series once. And it's amazing how much is there to unlock. And usually getting through it a second time, nobody has to be convinced to read it a third and a fourth and a fifth and even more.
Everything, really, because the first time you read it, the plot isn't that hard to understand on a surface level. You know that someone's going on a journey and they're trying to get out of the city. And you can go through all 5 books and there is although it's a time loop, there is a linear narrative that you can follow. And even though it's beautifully written and there are words that you don't understand, it doesn't trip you up. The balance is there. However, all the way through that first read, you do know that there is a feeling that there's so much more that you don't understand. So the second read through is probably the best. Second and third is the best because there's more clarity in what you've just read. So you're sharpening the plot and you know the characters and you know the kind of vibe and the thrust of the book, but you also understand that there is more to look out for. So you can let your guard down in some places. It sounds more complicated than it is, but you understand that it has many layers. And then when I done my last read through, it was a jumble of all the different layers on top of each other, understanding some of the nuances, really getting to grips with this time loop thing and having your mind blown how it all fits together. And there are more at the moment, and I'm 4 or 5 times through it, there are more questions than answers. So it is a book of discovery that I don't think, because it's not completely clear all of the time, I don't think the idea is to keep rereading it until you get to the very end and go, got it, now I can move on to a different book. I feel like I could keep reading this forever and find more, because there are just different ways to attack it. And I find that so rewarding.
There's no magic number where it's said you've read it enough. It's just reread it. Reread Book of the New Sun and you'll like it more. But that's true. And part of what comes with the rereading is that you learn how to read it better each time. And not only do you see more detail and put together the pieces more clearly, but also you start to see the larger themes at work. These ideas we're exploring of the universe recreating itself over and over, and what that means in terms of not just the value of life, literally all life that has ever existed, but also the value of the divine or the relationship of the divine to that life. And the concept of the divine in Book of the New Sun needs to be described. It's a concept that we see repeating over and over in Wolfe's works, where God is so distant from humanity that he's literally unreachable in every way. And this is clearly illustrated in Melito's story in Citadel of the Autarch, where he describes this angel coming down from heaven to put a rooster in his place on the farmyard. And he says to the rooster, look how much higher I am than you. You're an animal life form. I'm this angel of the host of God. But he says, even I have no idea what the Increate is thinking. I don't know what he looks like. I don't know what he speaks like. Like, he's so distant from me that it's inconceivable. The highest of the high cannot approach him because by definition, he is the peak. And what does it mean to have a God in that position? So stuff like this, I think, is pretty opaque on the first read, because on the first read, you're really just trying to figure out what's going on and saying, who is this weirdo Severian character and why is he going on these random adventures that don't mean anything and never come out the way that you think? It's only when you've been through the story and start coming through it again, you can start to see not just the positioning of the pieces, but also how those larger themes about life, death, the universe, and everything are constructed.
A lot of people love the Book of the New Sun and sing its praises, particularly other speculative fiction authors, many of whom were big fans of Gene Wolfe during his lifetime and close friends with him as well. I agree with all of them. It's an amazing work. But honestly, I think Gene Wolfe himself wrote some better novels than Book of the New Sun. I think his Book of the Long Sun is one that takes many of the ideas that are present in Book of the New Sun and others, and many of the themes that Gene Wolfe was interested in exploring throughout his career, the ideas of identity, the nature of slavery and freedom, and the question of what does it mean that there is a God that we can't fully understand out there, and that we still attempt to make ways to understand that God or have secondary gods there to interact as intermediaries. And it blows up all of those ideas in a way that's so profound that I'm still not sure I've fully unpacked that series. That then continues with the Book of the Short Sun for 3 more books, again talking about identity, the hierarchy of gods, the nature of freedom and slavery in completely different ways, and throwing in what are we if we are predator and prey to ourselves, and what does society gain from all of us working together that's not there when we exist in a solitary state of nature. So while I love the Book of the New Sun and the Earth of the New Sun and the ideas that they explore, I see them as an early step in Wolfe's career to investigate ideas that come back again and again through all of his novels.
It is the greatest book ever written in a lot of ways. I've just spent an hour yammering on about it. I feel like I've touched that much of it. But obviously not. Like, there's a billion great books, and it's foolish to compare them against each other. But I would say that Book of the New Sun does have a strong candidacy for greatest science fiction book. And I mean that in the sense that it is upheld as this thing which is literature, that is rising out of that gutter of genre fiction that it so often gets placed in. And that's a lot unfair to genre fiction, but it also stands as a banner for how good science fiction can be, how good fantasy can be, how good this imaginative way of conceiving of stories and this tradition that spans back more than 100 years of speculating, right? Speculative fiction. And to have a book of this quality, of this depth as that standard, speaks a lot to what this mode of fiction can achieve. So we can look towards it not only as an inspiration, but also something that stands head and shoulders with the best of the best, with your Melvilles and Cervantes and Shakespeare's. That's putting Wolfe in lofty company, but I think he belongs there.
No. There are a lot of great books written, but within genre, yes. Within genre of science fiction, the Book of the New Sun is the greatest book ever written, yes.
Is the Book of the New Sun the greatest book ever written?
The easy answer, I would say, is no, it's not. It's a great book. You know, it's part of what I would consider great literature, one of the greatest things that modern science fiction has put out. But is it the best book? No. Is it necessarily even going to last and be interesting to people in 100 years? I have no idea. I hope so.
Well, if it has this advantage. It's already incomprehensible to readers without careful detailing. So it doesn't lose anything in 400 years in that way.
Yeah, it'll always be nice if there's an economy of people who want to be experts, even in a very small economy. There are going to be people who will tell you, I have the answers and you know, come read my stuff or listen to me or whatever. But that's what often gets classified as great literature. No, I think often a lot of times it'll get called people's favorite book or the greatest book ever written, because in a lot of cases, it's sometimes one of the first really, really complicated, sophisticated things that people who have been reading a lot of adventure stories and genre fiction may encounter. Maybe not the first, but definitely one of the best. And so it feels like it's standing so far above. I mean, in truth, a lot of the things that Wolfe is doing are things that have been done many other places. I mean, he talks about how when he was writing this in Fifth Head, how he'd been looking at Proust and how he would often come up with ideas if he was stuck because he, you know, would take something from great literature and try to put it in a science fiction context. There's a big sense in which a lot of the origins of New Sun and the style are just saying, you know, what if Proust was in the far future when the world was dying and had to talk about things. And it sort of goes from there. So a lot of the stuff about how Severian talks, about the unreliable narrator, about the kinds of symbolism and stories that he uses. It's not that he was the first one ever to do those things, but it comes at the right time with the right mix of things, that you have all these genre tropes that he's using within another genre story, mixing other genres. And I think at the same time, it just had whatever whatever spark some of those great things have, that comes together in a way that just captures so many people's imagination. I would say, it's not even my favorite book. So I would say, we've talked about this before, what would our Desert Island books be? I mean, I still think that Lord of the Rings is better, but that doesn't mean that I think that, in the normal span of things, I don't go around ranking the top books and we'll die on the hill of which is better and best. It's just, thank the universe. There is so many good things out there. But yeah, so I'm not sure it is one of the greatest. No, it is one of the greatest. I'm not sure that any book is the greatest though.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of that.
By some category, perhaps it is.
Yes, it is. And if you don't agree, that's just because you haven't learned to love it the way that I do. Simple. It's all right. I'll wait.
Grand theories for the book of the new sun?
Grand theories. I think there are two basic ways to look at that. There is the theory, the explanation on what actually happens, so piecing the plot together. And then there is the meaning. What does it mean? What is the book trying to say? And I think they're two very different things. For the meaning, I think Gene Wolfe is trying to ask the reader, what is humanity's place in the universe? And I think he would rather have us think about it than come up with a conclusion. So it is Wolfe's attempt to make us think about our existence.
Do I have a grand theory? Do I have a grand theory? I have so many grand theories, Greg. I have cycled through so many grand theories, and I do have a grand theory, and I come to understand. It really kind of surprised me because I did not think this could be done with this book, but I have come to the understanding that this story is not about Severian, the guy who's narrating this. This is about the elusive fellow that Severian brings up in the last chapter, a guy whose life is very similar but different in very significant ways, who is the cause of everything else going around him. He's cause of all the interest in Severian, and Severian has to wander through his world and just react to what he's doing. And I mentioned that I had thought that the Book of the New Sun was kind of a envelope ripping novel, and that it kind of changes the way a novel usually goes. In that way, I think that it is quite different from your standard genre novel, in that it's more like a modernist poem where there's a puzzle piece, but it has an unstated puzzle piece that you can only imagine and describe.
I don't know that I have a theory in terms of a plot that would explain all the pieces, but I do have a more thematic theory that what he's done here is a kind of thought experiment that is nothing really like a straightforward, just Christian allegory, which is often what you'll hear. Instead, I like the idea that there's a certain kind of Gnostic thing going on here, but that what Wolfe has done is set up a world with, as he says in interviews and as he talks about in the book multiple times, with sort of cycles of history where the whole process of existence is repeated. But I like the idea that you start off with something that really is just random, material, not theological at all, completely, in fact, atheistic. And that over time you, because of certain choices or because of the possibilities in the world, end up developing into a kind of evolved theology. So there is a philosopher, theologian named Teilhard de Chardin, and pardon my French, but who has something similar like that. I certainly don't think Wolfe is just doing what he said, because there's a whole lot about de Chardin that doesn't work with Wolfe. But that general idea, I really like a lot. It meshes a lot with how many of the Brown Book stories seem to suggest God functions in this world, and fits really well with a lot of things from Earth of the New Sun. In addition.
Yeah,
So
I've often called this book the Narnia of Gnosticism, and there's a lot in there. And also, I kind of like something that you had told me a while back, that you kind of see this book as an anti-atheist book, in that God is nowhere to be seen anywhere, and yet he's everywhere on every page.
Yeah, there's something like that. And it's not what most people say. Like, there are a large number of people who are drawn to it because they feel like, oh, if Wolfe is Catholic, then I know what's really going on here. And I don't know. I mean, yes, Wolfe was Catholic. He had many stories that are saying what he believes, but he's also a speculative fiction writer. And I think he's fully free to be playing with lots of different ideas that may not just reflect orthodoxy at some deeper level. So I'm often suspicious of that take on what he's doing, and find it much more fascinating to see him playing with philosophical and theological ideas as well as scientific or fantastic or the normal sort of range of speculative fiction things. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think after discussing actually with Catholic readers on this topic, this is a novel that is self-evidently written by a Catholic, but Catholicism, I don't believe, is the key to this novel.
Yeah.
As far as grand designs, I also see Wolfe, and not just in this story, but in most of his oeuvre, deliberately trying to create myths in science fiction. He's following specific rules, I believe, that you see that by specific philosophies, particularly detailed in the very obscure work Hamlet's Mill, that where he is using all of the little pieces and parts in order to assemble his own myths, and so, which gives you this kind of crazy narrative at some points, things that hey, why did he do that? Why did he do this? Well, that's the way it works in myths as well.
Do I have a grand theory about the book? No. But I do tend to lean a lot on the first Severian, which is not so much a theory because it is mentioned in the text in Citadel of the Autarch. So I tend to think of things along those lines, which is grand. I guess it's a theory, but it's based on the text. Well, everybody says that, I guess. But so in a nutshell, the first Severian is, Severian in the Citadel of the Autarch says that he's not the first Severian, that the first Severian basically brought the new sun all on his own without the use of the claw or various miracles like that. And so I surmise that first Severian exists always about 10 years in the future. And the first Severian brought the new sun without the miracles and everything. So the first Severian is the rough draft of the Book of the New Sun. He is also the author of the Book of the New Sun because he's using the time travel to shape the narrative Severian, who is the finished edition, finished draft of the Book of the New Sun. And so again, even when people can agree that there's a first Severian, it gets very tricky after that as to how they interpret the whole thing. So yeah, I guess that's what my grand theory would be, more toward that.
Does everybody agree with you on this grand theory?
Does everybody agree with me? No, everybody does not agree with me. Does anybody agree with me? There may be some, but they're a quiet minority. Everybody just goes off in all sorts of different directions.
As far as what actually happened, a theory of the plot and all the mechanisms involved, part of the fun is I've got about 15, 20 different theories, and they can all exist in the same book at the same time. That's the fun of rereading it, because it's written like that by design. Because it's come through translation and interpretation, then there is no 100% clear. You can never say this is exactly what happened here, because it's passed through too many filters before it's got to your brain. But there are two big ideas that I really like. One of them isn't mine. Did Driussi talk about first Severian theory?
Yeah.
It gets mentioned a lot, and I'm fully on board with the first Severian theory, because the more I look into it, the more I read, the more details there are propping it up. It's as simple as that. It just works. And it becomes a relatively simple time loop manipulation story. So you're reading Severian, who is the most important person that ever lived. He is the savior. He is the new sun. He's also the angel of death, all of that good stuff. But he's been manipulated pretty much every step of the way, or that's what you're led to think. There is possibly every single thing that you read in the book has been manipulated by these other time travelers, including himself. So the first Severian thing links all of that together, and it's a wonderful thing.
In one way or another, I've been studying, talking about, listening to people, and reading the writings of others on these books for something like a decade. And one of the things that's amazing to me is how many different ways people interpret the Book of the New Sun. You can find lots of different through lines in this book, and you can find lots of ways to develop your own theories about it, or to try and find an overarching reason for everything that is happening. And for me personally, that's what's incredible about this book, that Wolfe created a work that is so strong that it can hold up against all of these different interpretations and still offer new mysteries for other people to go investigate and new reasons for us to come back to the books over and over again. I think there's great power in that, and I think that's one of the things Gene Wolfe was driving at when he talked about his idea of literature being something that you could reread with increasing pleasure. It's wonderful to me that he's been able to create something that's given us so much to talk about.
Going out on a limb, okay? I don't think anyone else agrees. I don't think I've ever said this out loud, but going out on a limb, I don't think, I think there is a chance that the Book of the New Sun, this story, is not taking place in the future of our Earth. It may not even be taking place in our universe. It could be many, many universes away and completely detached from where we are. Don't forget, this is a story about a continuous string of universes. So Wolfe has already built the backdrop of the multiverse, and Severian took a copy of his memoirs, a version of the Book of the New Sun, and he threw it in a wormhole that he was floating in front of in a place outside of time and space. So he was in a place outside of the universe. Doesn't mean he had to come from a version of our Earth. So the source material came from that place. It gets thrown into the wormhole. It goes back to, let's say, 1970s America, where a meta version of Gene Wolfe finds that book, and he then translates it into the Book of the New Sun. Now, it's so hard to understand what it was that he had, and he couldn't really decipher it very well. Hardly understood any of the words, just a basic framework of a person doing something. He had to fill in so many gaps from his own knowledge from the world around him that the Book of the New Sun became more of a reflection, whether this was intentional or not, more of a reflection of Gene Wolfe himself, the human Catholic Gene Wolfe. So he has imprinted himself on there. Now, if you took Neuromancer and sent it back in time to the ancient Sumerians, I choose them because they're about as far back as you can go that can read and write, I think. If they had to translate and decipher Neuromancer into their own language, their own way of thinking, it wouldn't just be a slightly weird Neuromancer. It would be unrecognizable to what Gibson wrote in the first place. And by the time you caught up with it 5,000 years later or whatever it is, you wouldn't go, oh, look, that's Neuromancer. I don't think you'd be able to tell the two apart. It would be almost gibberish because they would have to use their own worldview to fit that in. So the Book of the New Sun, even though it's got weird words and we're slightly blinkered to what's happening, we don't quite have a full grasp of what's happening in the book, I think it could be many, many levels deeper than that, and from a place and time and universe and way of thinking and whatever that's so different that none of that really happened. It's just Wolfe using it as a framework and getting his own stuff out there. I told you it was a flimsy theory.
I got a doozy. Now, this is completely off the page. There's no real evidence for it. But when I was reading through the book one of these last times, I was struck by the particular details of how Severian's perfect memory works. And every time I came across a particular piece of evidence on the page, I'd be like, Metz, see, right here? You'd have to edit that part out. But it really seems like Severian has to review his memory, almost like a videotape at times. I was thinking, what is the mechanism of that? And then in Earth of the New Sun, we get all these weird details about how Severian enters into his divinity. And he specifically doesn't have access to his god powers except when there's this star in the sky. And it takes millions of years to go through space and arrive to Earth. So it really appears back in ancient time, and it goes all the way up to the end of the book. And he has the ability to do all kinds of crazy stuff in that timeline, all the magical stuff, as long as whenever he's in the timeline and that star's in the sky, he's fine. And that star, as we know, is actually the new sun, which is coming to Earth. It's going to restart our sun and bring in this whole new age of the planet. So all this is taken for granted. It's the magic system of the book, we could say. But we also know that Wolfe tends to write more thoroughly than that. And there's this moment when Severian is in Yesod and they go down into the planet of Yesod. And Severian finds out that the whole inside of this planet is completely computer chips and data banks and other electronic devices. And for some odd reason, the entrance down into it, it says, abandon all hope, all ye who enter here, just like in the Inferno. So it has this hellish imagery. And all of that is never really explained. My crazy theory is that the star coming through space is actually Yesod, this planet, re-entering the universe, flying through the whole of existence until it finally reaches Earth. And so it's actually beaming him the science fiction powers that gives him all his energy to do the things he does. But if it's actually this planet that has all these electronics in it, why is that? Well, could they be storage and databases for his memory? That in his connection to the star, not only does he get the magical powers, but he also can like upload his experience as his experience. It's all saved up there. And so when he actually is looking and reviewing his perfect memory, what he's doing is beaming his consciousness up to the star, hitting play on the record button and seeing what happened. I think it's right.